Understanding what your book calls the alphabet soup of nutrition will give you a sense of how variable people really are and what they need. It's so easy to think that we're all identical, but we're really not. However, medical professionals do need to have some sort of guideline so that they can help assess and treat patients effectively. And as many of you are considering fields in the health sciences, you will be the people who will want to have at least these dietary reference intakes as guidelines so that you can get a sense for yourself of if a person is incredibly deficient in a particular vitamin, mineral, or let's say carbs or protein or what have you, or if they're taking way too much of something. Especially people tend to overdo some of the fat-soluble vitamins. People can overdo vitamin D, especially now that many of us are getting supplemented on it. The dietary reference intakes they come from the Institute of Medicine out of the National Academies and the Food and Nutrition Board. And they set all of the dietary reference intakes, and they get reassessed every 5 years based on current knowledge in the literature. So when we talked about nutrition research, there are thousands of studies that come out every year, and a board from the Institute of Medicine will sit down and evaluate all of the information that is known about, let's say, we're going to talk about vitamin D, and so we'll say vitamin D. The dietary reference intakes is the general term for a set of reference variables that are used to plan and assess nutrient intakes of healthy people. These values will vary by age and by gender, and they include our recommended dietary allowance, or the average daily level of intake sufficient to meet the nutrient requirements of 97 to 98% of healthy people. Adequate intake, or AI, which is established when evidence is insufficient to get quite to an RDA for a nutrient, and it's set as a level assured to ensure some sort of nutritional adequacy. The tolerable upper intake level, or the UL, which is the maximum daily intake that is unlikely to cause any adverse health effects. We'll talk also about the estimated energy requirement, or the EER, number of calories the average human should take in, and the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or what percentage of your diet should be carbs, lipids, and proteins. The original goal of setting dietary reference intakes was to prevent deficiencies that cause disease in the human population. A good example of this was the disease known as rickets, and obviously this disease still occurs today, but it's less common. In 1921, it was recognized by Hess and Unger that sunlight cured the condition, and so the condition is this prevalence of bowed legs, and it had to do with the vitamin D and calcium interaction in the bones, not creating strong bones. So the reason that sunlight was curing rickets was because UV light will convert an inactive form of vitamin D to an active form that then can be absorbed in the body. And so we can either get vitamin D through sunlight, or we can get vitamin D through our diet. And how humans process vitamin D is quite complex. And so I'm going to show you just honestly a relatively simplified schematic of how vitamin D is processed in our body. And the metabolism involves your skin, right? If you're out in the sunlight and you're getting UV sun, your liver and your kidneys, and because of how they convert the particular molecules into usable molecules in your body. And so it's more than just one thing, and this is why different people require different levels of vitamin D, is because each person's body is slightly different. To determine how much vitamin D individuals needed, so back in 1921 they figured out that sunlight was a reason, and then soon thereafter they figured out that it was actually due to this compound called vitamin D that prevented rickets. And so there's a process that needs to occur in order to figure out how much vitamin D should be recommended. What should the recommended dietary allowance be for vitamin D? And so the process is to investigate how much vitamin D is needed in a large number of individuals to keep them in a healthy state. And so we're going to look at individuals along the x-axis and international units of vitamin D along the y-axis. I have somewhat fabricated this data, though it's relatively similar, and obviously many more individuals than 50 might be used to actually get a sense really of what is necessary. But if we look at our first individual, that individual, in order to stay healthy, needed 450 international units, whereas the second individual we tested needed 650 units. The third individual, 225-ish. And as we keep going, we'll see that different individuals need different amounts of vitamin D in order to stay healthy. And so I'm going to go ahead and go through these relatively quickly. Notice that some individuals might need as little as 100 units, and others might need as much as 900 units. And so if you're the Institute of Medicine, you need to know where to set that line so that the majority of people get all of the vitamin D that they need in a day. So we're getting a recommended dietary allowance. The reasons for such differences are many. For example, some of the things that influence vitamin D, the amount of vitamin D a person needs, might be their age, their nutritional status. You need enough calcium in your diet for vitamin D to do its job. The amount of sun exposure and sunblock usage. Recently, we've been seeing that people with a lot of sunblock usage and low dietary intakes can have deficiencies in vitamin D. The skin tone. People with different skin tones uptake different amounts of vitamin D. Your living conditions. Do you live in an equatorial region? Do you live in a high latitude region? Your individual metabolism. On that last slide, we saw all of the different factors for converting different molecules of vitamin D into their active forms using our liver and our kidneys and through our skin. So there's so many different factors that will influence how much vitamin D a person actually needs. Once we get enough data from enough individuals, we then can turn these individual data points into a histogram. So we can put them into so once we have all of the individuals and what we and the amount of vitamin D that they need to be healthy, we then can figure out what the estimated average requirement is. And we do this by setting up groups, right? So we figure out how many individuals fell in needing 0 to 100 international units of vitamin D. And, oops, I went the wrong direction. Sorry about that. And then we look at how many for 100 to 200. So you'll notice that number of individuals is on the y-axis, and more people needed 100 to 200 units of vitamin D. 200 to 300 was even more international units. 300 to 400 looked like it was probably the most. 400 to 500, a few fewer. 500 to 600, fewer than that. And 600 to 700, even fewer. So this gives us kind of a bell curve, right? And these are our 50 individuals who we just looked at in the previous graph, grouped into 100 unit little categories. So if we want to know what the estimated average requirement is, we'd want to know that the estimated average requirement wants to maintain the biochemical and physiological function, so keeping people healthy, for 50% of the population of the same age and the same sex. And so we would place that number somewhere around here, maybe a little bit further to the right. So we'd get about 50% of the people. However, when we want to look at the recommended dietary allowance, we want 98% of the population to be covered with the recommended dietary allowance. So if we had 50 people, 49 of those 50 people should be covered. And so we should set the recommended dietary allowance somewhere much higher, maybe even a little higher than where that green line is, so that we get all but just one individual. And remember, these numbers are set by the Food and Nutrition Board and the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies. And so when we don't have, and so a recommended dietary allowance is when we have sufficient scientific evidence to back it up, whereas an adequate intake is identical to a recommended dietary allowance. An AI and a RDA are similar. The only difference is that an AI does not yet have enough scientific evidence to support the recommended amounts with the same amount of certainty. Your book compares your estimated average requirement to the recommended dietary allowance with this graph, showing that if you look at the red line, we have that well, first of all, B, A, and C are representing some of those individuals that we originally had in that first graph that we showed together, where we were looking at how much each person needed. And then we see that the red line shows us the average, the amount for 50% of the population to stay healthy, whereas the recommended dietary allowance is for 98%. Healthy people should include a margin of safety, and these are not necessarily minimums. They're designed to meet for most people, most of the time, and you should attempt to be getting these through your food. When a person takes in too much of a nutrient, that is when we get to their tolerable upper intake level, or past their tolerable upper intake level. And so we can look at the amount of nutrient a human takes in from the perspective of not getting enough, and that's a deficiency, being in exactly the right range for their metabolism and their diet, and that's in the safety range, and then having too much of a particular nutrient, and this would be where they're getting a toxicity of that nutrient. So vitamin D toxicity is called hypervitaminosis D. It's rare, but potentially quite serious, and it occurs when you have excessive amounts of vitamin D in your body. And so far has only been noted from taking mega doses of vitamin D, not from the food that you eat or from sunlight exposure. The reason it can be such a problem is because you wind up with excess calcium in your blood, and this causes poor appetite, nausea, and vomiting. And so left to its own devices, you might end up dehydrated, and it could be a real serious problem. Related to both the upper limit of the UL happens right about here, right? Where we're up to the end of the safe range and before it becomes toxic. And the RDA range is somewhere in the midst of the safety range, right? Because remember, we're getting 98% of the population, and so there's still some wiggle room down here between. So this upper limit here, probably RDA as just an example. Not only do dietary reference intakes look at how much of a nutrient we should receive, they also look at the nutrient amounts, so how many calories we should be getting in. And this is for things like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, the things that have calories associated with them. And to estimate the amount of energy required, we need to take into account a number of things, right? So the motivation for establishing an EER is tied to public health awareness and concern for the increased prevalence of overweight individuals and obesity in North America, and the need to adequately assess energy balance. So we need something for this. And the EER is based on a number of things, such as your energy intake, how much food you eat, your energy expenditure, and this is your basal energy expenditure, meaning to sleep, breathe, just keep your body functioning, breaking down your food, building proteins, all of those things. It's also based on your age, whether you're male or female, your weight. If you're heavier, your EER is greater. If you're taller, height, your EER is greater. And then your physical activity level. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about your physical activity level. Including the physical activity level in these calculations for the estimated energy requirement makes achieving an energy balance a much more realistic goal. However, our physical activity level is often difficult to measure and to get an accurate assessment, right? Because in order to get a really accurate assessment, we have to use one of these apparatus where we're hooked in, and they're measuring both everything we breathe in and everything we breathe out, and exactly how much physical activity we're doing. And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. With the advent of personable wearable electronics, this is becoming easier and easier for the average human to get a better sense of their actual physical activity level and estimating their energy requirements needed for a day. The nice thing about these different devices is they actually ground truth their devices with these types of official apparatus. And so I went and was reading about some of the different activity trackers, and it turns out they actually will put somebody in a contraption like this and have them, actually I guess I should say this, and have them wear either a Fitbit or a Jawbone or a Nike Fit or what have you along with this apparatus, and then look at how closely the two match, and then they use a series of equations. The EER is based on an equation, and we'll figure that out for ourselves in one of the chapters this semester. However, with the advent of these new wearable fitness devices, the equation is being done for you, and depending on how active you are and in terms of how vigorous your activity is, the device is keeping track of that and giving you more calories expended or less calories expended. So if I walk at a really slow pace versus I run, my activity tracker will be able to tell that was a more vigorous activity and give me more calories burned. So it's kind of interesting that our new technologies are actually really delving into this, and ideally should be able to help us if we pay attention. An interesting note about how about how EER will compare with your recommended dietary allowance. So EER again is how much you burn, right? Or how much energy you might need in a day. And so it's set right at the 50% level. You'll notice that it's set here at the 50% level, whereas your RDA is set up at the 98% level. And that's because people don't necessarily need to take in. You can go at a deficit for a number of days, whereas going at a deficit for a nutrient would be much more detrimental. If we were to set the estimated average energy requirement way up here, where the RDA is, then we would risk more people being at an overweight or obese level. And so it's set right at the 50. The last piece that we want to make sure we cover for Chapter 1 is about the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And it has to do with what percentage of our diet should be carbohydrates, what percent should be lipids or fats, and what percentage should be proteins. So it turns out that 45 to 65% of our diet should be carbohydrates. And we'll go into this in a lot of detail as to why carbohydrates are so incredibly necessary, even though they seem to have a bad rap in the media right now. They really are necessary for effective functioning of your body. So 45 to 65% is carbohydrates. 20 to 35% as lipids or fats, and so because they give us, remember, quite a bit of energy. And then 10 to 35% of proteins. And these are the ranges that keep people healthy based on what their needs are. And these are considered the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. Depending on who you are and what you like to eat, you get to choose within these ranges what you want. You could have, they say that if you put yourself at a 60-20-20, so 60 carbs, 20 lipids, 20 protein, that you maximize your energy levels. Whereas they say that for a more balanced, healthy lifestyle, just for the average person, that a 50-20-30 balance is better. So 50 carbs, 30 lipids, and 20 protein. And then you'll hear many people talk about having a much higher protein diet, and those are only recommended if you're aware of what you're doing, or under the supervision of a doctor to do it. And oftentimes they're for elite athletes looking to build muscle mass and reduce their body fat. But again, for the average person, you want to stay within the ranges of 45 to 65, 20 to 35, and 10 to 35 to make sure you're getting enough of everything that you need. Again, you may feel different on a different combination, and you may try those different combinations, and it'd be kind of fun if you had the discipline to be able to keep yourself at a 60-20-20 for 2 or 3 weeks and see how you felt, and then switch to a 50-30-20 for 2 weeks and see how you felt, and then switch it, keep switching it around until you found what worked best for you. Because as we have pointed out throughout this little section of the lecture, everybody is hugely different with how their metabolism responds, and how much vitamin of each thing they need, and how much carbohydrate each person needs. And so there is a range. Not everybody is the same. And if you really want to know what's right for you, you need to take the time to figure that out and really put yourself on a strict diet for a period of time until you figure out what makes you feel best.